Penguin Random House Audio presents The Last Days of Night by Graham Moore. Read for you by Johnathan McClain. Part 1. Salience. Don't you understand that Steve doesn't know anything about technology? He's just a super salesman. He doesn't know anything about engineering, and 99% of what he says and thinks is wrong. Bill Gates. Chapter 1. The Last Days of Night. People don't know what they want until you show it to them. Steve Jobs. May 11th, 1888. On the day that he would first meet Thomas Edison, Paul watched a man burn alive in the sky above Broadway. The immolation occurred late on a Friday morning. The lunchtime bustle was picking up as Paul descended from his office building onto the crowded street. He cut an imposing figure against the flow of pedestrians. 6 feet 4 inches, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, clothed in the matching black coat, vest, and long tie that was to be expected of New York's young professional men. His hair, perfectly parted on the left, had just begun to recede into a gentle widow's peak. He looked older than his 26 years. As Paul joined the throng along Broadway, he briefly noticed a young man in a Western Union uniform standing on a ladder. The workman was fiddling with electrical wires, the thick black cables that had recently begun to streak the skies of the city. They crisscrossed the thinner, older telegraph wires, and the spring winds had gusted them into a knotty bundle. The Western Union man was attempting to untangle the 2 sets of wires. He looked like a child, flummoxed by enormous shoelaces. Paul's mind was on coffee. He was still new to the financial district, new to his law firm's offices on the 3rd floor of 346 Broadway. He hadn't determined which of the local coffee houses he preferred. There was the one to the north, along Walker, and the slower-serving but more fashionable one on Baxter, with the rooster on the door. Paul was tired. The air felt good against his cheeks. He hadn't been outside yet that day. He'd slept in his office the night before. When he saw the first spark, he didn't immediately realize what was happening. The workman grabbed hold of a wire and tugged. Paul heard a pop. Just a quick, strange pop, as the man shuddered. Paul would later remember seeing a flash, even if at the time he wasn't sure what it was. The workman reached out for support, grasping another wire with his free hand. This, Paul would come to understand, was the man's mistake. He'd created a connection. He'd become a live conductor. And then, both of the workman's arms jolted with orange sparks. There had to be 200 people crowding the street that morning, and every head seemed to turn at the same time. Financiers parading in their wide-brimmed top hats, stock traders' assistants sprinting down to Wall Street clutching secret messages, social secretaries in teal skirts and sharp matching jackets, accountants out hunting for sandwiches, ladies in douce dresses visiting from Washington Square, local politicians eager for their duck lunches, a fleet of horses dragging thick-wheeled cabs over the uneven cobblestones. Broadway was the artery that fueled Lower Manhattan. A wealth heretofore unknown on the face of the earth was burbling up from beneath these very streets. In the morning's paper, Paul had read that John Jacob Astor had just become officially richer than the Queen of England. All eyes fixed on the man in the air. A blue flame shot from his mouth. The flame set fire to his hair. His clothes burned off instantly. He fell forward, his arms still wrapped around the wires. His feet dangled against the ladder. His body assumed the position of Jesus upon the cross. The blue flame fired through his mouth and melted the skin from his bones. No one had screamed yet. Paul still wasn't even sure what he was watching. He had seen violence before. He'd grown up on a Tennessee farm. Death and the dying were unspectacular sights along the Cumberland River, but he'd never seen anything like this. Epical seconds later, as the man's blood poured onto the teenage newsboys below, the screaming began. A stampede of bodies fled the scene. Grown men knocked into women. The newsboys ran through the crowd, not heading anywhere in particular, simply running, trying to pull the charred flesh from their hair. The horses reared on their haunches, kicking their legs into the sky. Their hooves flew at the faces of their panicked owners. Paul was frozen in place until he saw a newsboy fall in front of the wheels of a two-horse carriage. The stallions shook at their reins, lurching forward and drawing the wheels toward the boy's chest. Paul was not aware of making the decision to lunge. He simply did it. He grabbed the boy by the shoulder, pulling him out of the road. Paul used his coat sleeve to brush the dirt and blood from the child's face, but before Paul could check him for injuries, the boy fled into the crowd again. Paul sat down against a nearby telegraph pole. His stomach churned. He realized he was panting and tried to steady his breath as he rested in the dirt. It was another 10 minutes before the ringing of bells announced the arrival of the firemen. 3 horses pulled a water truck to a stop beside the grim scene. A half-dozen firemen in black buttoned uniforms lifted their disbelieving eyes to the sky. One reached instinctively for his steam-powered hose, but the rest simply gazed in horror. This was like no fire they'd ever witnessed. This was electricity. And the dark marvel of man-made lightning was as mysterious and incomprehensible as an Old Testament plague. Paul sat transfixed for the 45 minutes it took the fearful firemen to cut down the blackened body. He took in every detail of what he saw, not to remember, but to forget. Paul was an attorney, and this was what his as-yet brief career in the law had done to his brain. He was comforted by minutiae. His mortal fears could be assuaged only by an encyclopedic command of detail. Paul was a professional builder of narratives. He was a teller of concise tales. His work was to take a series of isolated events and, shearing them from their dross, craft from them a progression. The morning's discrete images, a routine labor, a clumsy error, a grasping arm, a crowded street, a spark of fire, a blood-speckled child, a dripping corpse, could be assembled into a story. There would be a beginning, a middle, and an end. Stories reach conclusions, and then they go away. Such is their desperately needed magic. That day's story, once told in his mind, could be wrapped up, put aside, and recalled only when necessary. The properly assembled narrative would guard his mind from the terror of raw memory. Even a true story is a fiction, Paul knew. It is the comforting tool we use to organize the chaotic world around us into something comprehensible. It is the cognitive machine that separates the wheat of emotion from the chaff of sensation. The real world is overfull with incidents, brimming over with occurrences. In our stories, we disregard most of them until clear reason and motivation emerge. Every story is an invention, a technological device not unlike the very one that on that morning had seared a man's skin from his bones. A good story could be put to no less dangerous a purpose. As an attorney, the tales that Paul told were moral ones. There existed in his narratives only the injured and their abusers, the slandered and the liars, the swindled and the thieves. Paul constructed these characters painstakingly until the righteousness of his plaintiff, or his defendant, became overwhelming. It was not the job of a litigator to determine facts. It was his job to construct a story from those facts by which a clear moral conclusion would be unavoidable. That was the business of Paul's stories, to present an undeniable view of the world. and then to vanish.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?